Hello guys, I'm Surendiran from PGPPM student. Today let's take a journey India's the poverty, inequality and the macroeconomic challenges from the early years of the planning in 1951 up to 2006. So the poverty, the early years 1951-1981 at the independence, India was a very poor country. By 1980, more than half of the world, absolutely the poor lived in India. From 1951 to 1981, despite ambitious 5 years plans, poverty remained stubbornly high. Why? The first growth was extremely slow. Per capita income grew by just about the 1% of year, while the population grew at over the 2%. This was a famous called the Hindu rate of growth. The second, India's industrialization strategy was flawed. The focus was on heavy industries like steel and machinery instead of the labor intensive sector like textiles, clothing, or light manufacturing that could create more employment. The third, there was a confusion between equity and the poverty reduction. Policies were designed to redistribute the income rather than to promote the growth. Example, very high income tax rates at the times up to 95%. Restrictive labor laws that made it hard for the firms to expand and hire workers. Reserving labor intensive products for the small scale industries which blockade large factories from the entering the export markets. Confining the large business houses to capital incentive sectors, limiting job opportunities. The results, despite the planning and the state led development, poverty levels stayed high throughout the 1950 and 1960 and 1970 also. The part 2, the shift, the 90s 80s onwards. Things began to change in the early 1980s. Growth picked up, partially due to the gradual liberalization and reform. Between the late 70s and 2000, India's poverty ratio was almost halved. For example, 1993-94 poverty was about the 36%. By 2004 and 2005 had fallen to 27.8%. So what they explain the sharp decline? Economists uh, argue that it was a growth driven poverty reductions when per capita growth rose to 3% or more. The poor were not just waiting the trickle down. Instead, growth created an active pull up the effect. More jobs, higher wages, and better opportunities also. The trade liberalizations also played a role. Research shows that states more exposed to trade reform thus saw faster poverty reductions. Critics argued that growth in the 1990s was jobless, but evidence says otherwise. Unemployment rate in 1990s were not higher than 1987 and 1988. Rural wages rose steadily, pointing to a real improvement in living the standards. There was also concern about the farmer suicides, while tragic. Uh, this was these were the concentrated in the specific states like Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Kerala, and Maharashtra, were linked in more debit and dependence on the informal credit than to the reformed across India. And part 3, inequality, a lesser problem. Now let's talk about the inequality. So nationally, rural inequality remained stable or even declined between the mid 1990s and 2000s, while urban inequality rose somewhat. But since urban poverty also fell sharply, the rise in inequality was not alarming. The real problem came from the equity driven policies in the earlier decades that had a backfired. During Indira Gandhi's time, for example, nationalization of the bank and industries, straightened licensing, recruitment for the investment, land ceiling, and a restriction on the worker of layoff. These policies may have been well intentioned, but they discouraged wealth creation, slowed growth, and ultimately hurt the poor. At the regional level, inequality between the states did rise. Richer states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu grew faster, widening the gap with the poor states. But importantly, no state was getting poorer. Most states saw faster growth after the reforms, just different speeds. In fact, some inequality may have had a demonstrated effect, motivating lagging states adopt the reform that catch up. The part 4, the macroeconomic overview of 1951 2006. So in 1950s to 1970s, India has followed a model of state level development, heavy planning, and important substitution growth was slow. So foreign trade was minimal and the fiscal deficits were controlled, but the investment efficiency was low. Poverty remained high. 1980s, growth accelerated around the 5 to 6% per year, thanks to the partial liberalization, such as easing license rules, promoting exports, and allowing the more private sector participations. This was the first real turning point into the India's poverty reductions. 1991, the reforms, the balance of the payments crisis forces India to adopt the liberalization, privatization, and the globalization policies. The economic opened up, the traffic came down, the rupee was devalued, and the foreign investment encouraged. By the 2016, India was no longer seen as a miserably poor country. Poverty had fallen substantially, inequality was manageable, and the country had become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So, in 1951 to 1981, India's poverty reduction was the minimal, mainly due to the slow growth and flawed policies. From the 1980s onwards, the reform, the faster growth drove sharp poverty reduction. Inequality did rise in some areas, but it was the lesser issue compared to the poverty. So 1951 and 2006, India transitions from a slow growing closed economy to a fast growing reform oriented one, with the millions lifted out of the poverty. Thank you.